Hello, this is Nabila Rahman. I'm the Digital Transformation Strategist in United News of Bangladesh, UNB, and have been holding leadership roles in the tech industry for decades. Today, I'm very excited to launch our third webinar of the Tech Collective, and the topic for today is cryptocurrency. I'm sure a lot of you have already heard of cryptocurrency, and it's a decentralized digital money that's based on blockchain technology. You may be familiar with the most popular versions, Bitcoin and Ethereum, but there are more than 5,000 different cryptocurrencies in circulations. So most people invest in cryptocurrency as they would in other assets like stocks or precious metals. While cryptocurrency is a novel and exciting asset class, purchasing it can be risky, as you must take on a fair amount of research to fully understand how each system works. Today, we will be discussing a lot regarding this cryptocurrency, the technology, the platform policies that are shaping regarding this, and especially what's going on with Ukraine and the rise in crypto and the exciting stuff that's happening all around us. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce my co-host, Samuel Bretzfield, who's a tech entrepreneur living in Bangladesh for many years and will be co-hosting with me in this webinar. Sam, over to you.
Thanks so much, Nabila. I'm so excited. Our third webinar of the Tech Collective. This is great. My name is Sam Bretzfield for the audience again. I'm a tech entrepreneur with over 25 years of leadership experience. I've been living in Dhaka, where I oversee B Global, which is an IT outsourcing company. I'm really excited today to introduce to you Khurram Dara. Khurram is a lawyer based in New York City. He's a graduate of the Columbia Law School, received his undergraduate degree from Emory University. Khurram's professional experience includes working for some of the top law firms in the world, focused on policy issues related to technology, infrastructure, and financial services. He's a published author with many opt-ins written in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, CNN. Khurram, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Sam and Nabila. I'm really excited to be here. And thanks for the introduction, Sam. Like you mentioned, I'm a lawyer. I'm based here in New York. I went to law school mainly because I was always very interested in law and policy and politics. Was also very interested in religion. I think more broadly, I've just been very interested in how people coordinate and interact with each other, particularly people who may not know each other, who may not be family or friends, but have to coordinate for some reason or another, whether it's in a commercial arrangement and a contract, whether it's some kind of more social or political arrangement or otherwise. And so I think for all of those reasons, when I was a young attorney working more on corporate law, kind of traditional financial services, I sort of got a little bit enamored and interested in Bitcoin and reading about cryptocurrency back in 2017. And at the time, I had a friend who had moved to the city, Jordan Freed. He had just sold his company and he was working on a new venture, basically joining the founding team of a new, basically distributed ledger technology company that would eventually introduce their own token. And I brought them over to the law firm at Oric, and they were one of our first clients in what At the time we were calling the digital assets or blockchain group. And I sort of became kind of the person at the law firm on the associate level that was doing a lot of the crypto work in 2017 going into 2018. Sam, that's when you and I connected, and I had decided to make the jump from the law firm to go to a crypto startup here in Brooklyn called AirSwap. It was a peer-to-peer trading platform. It's still around. It's a trading protocol. It got acquired by Consensus. And that was a lot of fun. It was a great experience. And then since then, I've basically been advising and helping startups across the board, but a lot of, especially lately, Web3 and crypto startups. And it's been a lot of fun. Mostly work on the legal and regulatory, but also consulting side. And on that, quick disclaimer, also, nothing on here is that I say is legal advice. And as Nabila mentioned earlier, you should not construe anything as it relates to crypto as an investment advice. Should always check with your financial investors,
not
advisors.
Financial advice.
Yeah, exactly. not financial advice. All kinds of disclaimers that we always have to say on these, because there are risks with anything, sure, with technology generally.
Absolutely.
Can you just help us with this lingo, the difference between crypto, coins, tokens? I mean, we hear all these things. A little bit, very short, a little intro on each of these. Crypto, coins, tokens.
Yeah. When people talk about cryptocurrencies specific, so when people say crypto, they might just generally mean the space. When they're talking about cryptocurrency specifically, usually you're talking about a base layer or protocol level coin. This is a cryptocurrency that functions with a specific blockchain network and is required for that network to operate. On top of that are tokens. Tokens are basically smart contracts that you can create on a particular blockchain. And I think people colloquially will refer to coins as both of those, as cryptocurrencies, and tokens as just coins. But the difference is that cryptocurrencies are usually that base layer, like your Bitcoin, Ether, Sol for Solana. And then you have, I believe Sol for Solana, that might be wrong, but I know Bitcoin and Ether are base level protocol coins. And then you have tokens on top of that. And most tokens are typically built on Ethereum, and they're called ERC20 tokens. And those are usually function with applications or with platforms or with communities for utility or for governance purposes.
Tell us a little bit, so just to kind of break it down, explain to us a little bit about the difference between a decentralized exchange and a centralized exchange. What are the differences between all these currencies? I mean, we hear about Bitcoin, we hear about Ethereum, Polygon, Ape Coin with the Bored Ape Yacht Club just dropped a coin a couple of days ago. So what are all the differences between the coins? The difference between maybe a stable coin versus, a Bitcoin store value. Could you just kind of lay the groundwork for us? Tell us a little bit about the differences.
Yeah, sure. I guess maybe first on the centralized versus decentralized point, and I think there's a lot of different ways that you could talk about centralization versus decentralization, but I think one of the first ways that people think about it as it relates to crypto is by starting with blockchain technology more broadly. And again, full disclosure, I'm not on the technical side, so a lot of this is probably oversimplified, but the nice part is I'm usually talking to folks who maybe aren't technical either, so I find ways to explain things in ways that are maybe exactly.
No, we want
because
that.
Most of our viewers are not probably tech savvy, and we want the layman term, so it's perfect.
So kind of backing up, I guess, to the centralization versus decentralization on the base layer protocol level. When you think about a traditional website or an app, almost, in every case, you're going to need a database component. There's going to be a component where the information for your accounts related to whatever software you provide or whatever app or service you provide is going to be stored. And for the first kind of early portion of the internet, a lot of that storage was in a kind of centralized fashion. You would need to have a database on your computer to host an app. These days, more practically, people use the cloud, but it's still essentially a computer centralized somewhere where information is stored. When you talk about distributed systems, what you're talking about is taking that kind of centralized silo and saying, what are the ways that we can decentralize that and spread that out, whether it's having, different nodes or through some other means of decentralizing a network. So you're not having all of the nodes or all of the computers on your network in an environment where a single point of failure could result in the entire operation being compromised. And so when you think about the way blockchains work, it's almost like a public database rather than having information stored where one central party can control and access it. You have information stored in a transparent and public way that makes it much harder for a single point of failure or a single attack to compromise the entire system. And I think when you talk about where crypto fits into that, you might be asking yourself, just as a practical matter, if I have a centralized system or a database, obviously that seems a little bit safer than just having an open system or a distributed system. And that's kind of where crypto comes in. It serves as a mechanism to provide incentives for a public database or a public open system to function properly. So when you talk about Bitcoin, when you talk about ETH, on Ethereum, those are cryptocurrencies that pair with those base layer protocols. Those networks, if you want to use the Bitcoin network, if you want to use Ethereum, you have to use those. The cryptocurrency is what powers that network. If you want to write to that network, if you want to process a transaction, you need that cryptocurrency in order to allow that database to function in the way it's intended. So that's kind of the base layer piece of it. When you talk about this explosion of other assets and all these other tokens that you hear about, those are typically a layer on top of one of these base layers. The most popular one is Ethereum because that layer enables the creation of smart contracts called tokens that can be whipped up pretty easily on top of the Ethereum network. Now, these tokens are much easier to create, but they only work with a particular blockchain. So Sam, when you were going through the different blockchains earlier, all of those different chains may have an asset that's native to that chain, but the idea is those assets would really only work in that ecosystem. And that's really, after 2017 or in 2017, you saw this explosion that was driven primarily by Ethereum because Bitcoin doesn't necessarily lend itself well as a network to, for reasons that I couldn't get into and from a technical standpoint, to being a platform where people would easily mint tokens on top of versus an Ethereum or something like Solana.
Right. And so how do stablecoins play a role in this world? Like Tether or USDC coin. I've seen a lot of talk recently, at the policy level in DC, the central bank, Federal Reserve is thinking about putting out a US stablecoin. How does that play a role in this world?
So stablecoins are a little bit different in the sense that they are using this technology and the asset related to the use of this technology to represent some other value in the real world. In this case, when people say stablecoin, usually they mean that they want that other value that the asset is representing to be at some fixed or stable denomination or price. And usually to do that, it requires some kind of real world backing, whether it's like a one-to-one collateralization or, some of the more exotic products out there kind of have some, algorithmic type arrangements as far as how they would try to maintain a certain peg. But that is fundamentally different, I would say, than Bitcoin or Ether or really any token that sits on top of a native blockchain, in the sense that the kind of first use case for a lot of this was not to use these assets to represent things in the real world, but to use them to represent things in some database or some kind of distributed system, or in the case of tokens, in some kind of online ecosystem, online community, or metaverse, if you will. I think the use of these assets to relate to specific real world assets, it's certainly a very key component of all of this. I think that the stablecoin allows people to engage in different types of transactions a little bit more comfortably and a little bit more conveniently. But it's a different use of the technology. It's the same way that you often hear people trying to use blockchain technology to represent traditional financial instruments. whether it's a stock or a share, a company equity. And again, that's another example where, in that case, what you're doing is you're taking some of the underlying technology and you're using it to represent something in the real world. Again, I don't have a value judgment on which one is better or not. I just think the first one is a little bit more interesting because when you talk about using tokens to power a platform, using tokens for governance, using a cryptocurrency to power a public database or a public ledger of information, that allows and enables things that we previously weren't able to do. Whereas I think using these assets to represent things in the real world may unlock all kinds of new innovation, but I think is a little bit more similar to the way that any kind of new technology that emerges has that effect of increasing efficiency in financial transactions and in communications when there's switch from analog to digital. That I think is could very well be very valuable, maybe more valuable. I tend to think that the first part of the innovation, the use of digital representation of value for things that we previously didn't really have a great way of necessarily valuing.
That's a good segue. So, I mean, we talk about innovation, but we also think about policy. I know that President Biden 2 weeks ago signed an executive order. What are the kind of key takeaways there from that order? Do you think it stifles adoption or innovation in any way, or we just don't know yet? Is it too early? Any comments or thoughts on that?
The effect of like the individual order itself, I don't have a strong view. I think it's good, and it's probably bullish for the space that the U.S. government is doing more. It seems like policymakers spend a lot of time studying this technology, which I understand. It requires study, but I think one of the things that all regulation, just writ large, not specific to this executive order, seems to focus on is the financial aspects of the technology and its relationship with traditional finance. And I think it's not new for whatever the latest technology is to often be in a kind of a gray area from a regulatory or policy perspective in terms of maybe fitting in an area where legislation or regulation hasn't really addressed or covered this type of new innovation, and you have areas on the margins where you're not sure, is this going too far one way or another? You look at marketplaces, Airbnb, Uber, things like that, in the kind of Web 2 concepts and social media. All of these kind of operated in some gray areas to some extent, but the gray areas they operated in tended not to be regulated financial markets and things that are traditionally handled by regulated financial institutions. And one of the unfortunate aspects or one of the kind of, I guess, challenges for Web3 and for crypto is that you're operating in a lot of cases on a surface level in the same environment, or at least a kind of adjacent environment to a lot of financial products and a lot of traditional financial services, which in the United States and pretty much anywhere around the world these days, financial products are very heavily regulated. Money is very heavily regulated, and so it's not surprising that a lot of the regulation and policy focuses on that aspect. Consumer protection, I think, was one of the main points in the executive order, wanting to make sure that they're not stifling innovation, but also balancing some of the risks of fraud and people, taking advantage of the speculation and the lack of understanding of this new technology to maybe swindle folks. And I think all of that is very important, but I think maybe misses the mark sometimes on the larger potential use case for Web3. And this was kind of what I was alluding to in your earlier question that you mentioned was a good segue of, when you think about stable coins and using this technology for traditional financial instruments or to represent money, the way that we traditionally think about money versus the kind of first way that this technology introduced itself, which was representing value that by kind of our traditional measures was not backed by anything other than the value of the network or some kind of perceived value of the software or the service or the community that asset was tied to. And I think when you think about it in those terms, the kinds of concerns and things that you would be thinking about from a policy perspective may be a little bit different. So when I think of crypto, I don't necessarily see it like other people do as a replacement for money or as a replacement for the traditional financial system. I think more often than not, new technologies are additive. So, we all still use laptops and smartphones really came and took over, and there's way more smartphones, but laptops and mainframe computers and kind of all of those legacy technologies are still really important. Telecom companies are not at the forefront of smartphones necessarily, but they're still a big part of, I was joking with you that my Wi-Fi is out in my building right now, right? So it's like, these things don't necessarily go away. So I don't think, like, in my personal opinion, and this is just a guess, I don't know that this stuff will replace traditional finance. I see it as allowing, and I think other people have said this, Aaron Wright from Cardozo Law, who's one of the really good legal and regulatory experts in the space. I think he had said something to the effect, or tweeted something to the effect of, the financialization of things on the internet that were previously not financialized, something to that effect, where you're able to monetize or capture or represent value of digital goods or digital services or digital software, or not software generally, or communities, or the value of networks, things that we previously didn't really have a good way of creating and transacting value in a kind of direct sense. And I think that's a little bit more interesting to me. And I think that it's a little unfortunate, I think, from the US perspective, that the trajectory that crypto took was very much in the direction of financial markets. And there's a very good reason for it, which is that, I think if people are being honest, the main draw for a lot of initial interest was the amount of money that was there as a gold rush, right? There's this idea that folks can make multiples of investment returns that are not even close to what you would get in even the highest performing funds. And I think that for that reason, it's unsurprising that that's the way that the shape that the regulatory framework kind of took on. But I see that as much of a kind of digital land grab as you might be able to put it, versus necessarily something that threatens traditional finance and needs to be seen through the same lens that we would look at some investments and stocks and regulating it in that fashion. I think there's some risk that we kind of miss the mark by doing that. But again, understandable why those things come into play, given the kind of nature of our legacy financial institutions.
Sure. So is Bitcoin so go ahead, Nabila. Yep.
Oh, I just wanted to say what you said is very true about having things parallelly, the decentralized versus centralized with the regulatory, and both can coexist. We can see the same, like cash is never going to go out in the next 5 years. You'll still have the mobile wallets that has come. So it's kind of, the Bitcoins of the world should, it's a new technology, it's a new innovation, but I feel like there's a lot of countries with the policies, they're fearful. I just wanted to bring that to the table and talk about like how Ukraine, who's ranked as an early adopter of cryptocurrencies, and with the recent invasion, a lot of the Ukrainians are resorting to crypto since their bank accounts have been frozen. And Ukraine has also passed a law that creates a legal framework for the cryptocurrency industry in the country, which allows foreign and Ukrainian cryptocurrency exchanges to operate legally as digital currency donation for in the country with the invasion. What should be the role of the government in these policy-making decisions, you think?
Yeah, it's tough because it sounds, when you talk about anything that's censorship resistant or that's able to function outside of governments, it's kind of natural that you would expect governments to not want those types of technologies to exist freely because they see it as a kind of a potential threat or a way to kind of get around their control over whatever policies or rules they have as it relates to how they want money to flow in their country. But I think you see, in addition to what we were just talking about earlier in terms of the ability to capture value in ways that we couldn't before, the kind of other very big value proposition here is the censorship resistance aspect of this, that, what I think the question of what role government should play when it comes to looking at the technology in that sense is almost, I don't want to say it's moot, but it's like they're sort of limited in what they can do. Even if they wanted to try to stop it, it's very difficult to stop. It's possible. And I think if governments, the way that a lot of the regulation takes shape is they regulate the on and off ramps. And those are the places where governments will really step in. And that seems like an appropriate place to regulate, given that, there are all kinds of valid reasons for why, a country would want to, or a government would want to make sure that someone who wasn't sanctioned was transacting or having money flow through their country or through their institutions. Of course, on the flip side, I don't think anyone would want any kind of policy that tried to wholesale prohibit this type of technology, because I think that would be seen as kind of an overreach. And I think in cases like Ukraine, you see, cases where it's very important, or people are using it in that capacity, and the fact that it's censorship resistant and there's an ability for people to transact becomes a kind of lifeline. So, I guess it's a tough question, I guess, to answer as far as, what government should do. I think it's a balance, and like any other technology, I think that the best thing to do would be to look at it through the perspective of, there's going to be situations where that technology can be used for very positive things, and there's going to be situations where that technology can be used for negative things. And the first thing is to, understand how the technology works and what it is before you kind of go swinging with a policy that's maybe too broad on one side or another. So I guess if I had a recommendation, it would be to the extent possible, continue regulating what you currently regulate, but try to watch and listen and see what's happening, and take a holistic view.
Yeah, I think that's very good advice. Especially, I don't know if you've done, if you're looking into Bangladesh market, because obviously crypto is not here yet. I don't think it's legal yet. We don't have it. So any advice for the Bangladesh government in terms of policy for crypto and what we should be thinking about?
Well, I think crypto is one of those things that fits into a bucket of other, I think, general events in the last, 10 or 20 or last few decades, where you might say to yourself, like, there's like a number of things that happen that maybe are unexpected, or that traditional institutions, if they had their way and were still able to gatekeep as much as they used to, maybe wouldn't necessarily want these types of technologies or platforms around in the way they exist. And I think that's a reflection of the new environment that we live in with so much information flow, but particularly the fact that everybody has a phone now, basically, and everybody's connected. And when you have a phone, it has all these kinds of, I think, effects that we don't necessarily account for, that is maybe producing some of these unexpected trends or technologies or uses of technology. Whether it's in a political sense, candidates that I think, if the traditional powers that be had their way, would not necessarily be the representatives of a particular party or another, but nonetheless, do really well. Crypto is another example where I think if, governments and the institutions globally that traditionally handled finance and money had their way, would not be kind of as I think freely or as widely used, and probably wouldn't exist in the fashion it exists today if it was up to them, if they were the ones designing it, right? And so that I think is driven by the fact that, we're living in a kind of new environment, and the beginning of this new century, I think, has been marked by a lot of these unexpected events that are driven by the changes in technology and the changes in the information environment. And so my advice for governments is to to kind of look at the big picture of what's happening, because the role that gatekeepers have has changed, and their ability to control or prohibit the use of technology is going to be limited and different, and probably going to have a different effect than they maybe intend, given the changed information environment. And I would encourage them to start thinking about the world in kind of a different way than the way that you might have thought about the world before smartphones, because I think the changed environment creates this sort of, Martin Gurry has this really book called The Revolt of the Public, which, basically makes this case that a lot of the changed information environments that we live in and the changed forms of media create this situation where the public is able to have their way, maybe with the traditional institution or the traditional gatekeeper, and the public has a little bit more power than, say, the gatekeeper or the government or the institution does. So I think governments that want to be sustainable in the long run and not be in this kind of constant battle of, it seems like when you look across social, culture, and political issues, you can sometimes divide between the more traditional institutionalist view of things and the kind of newer, the sort of up and coming, different way of thinking about things. And I think, being a little bit more open to understanding that newer way is going to have a lot more power than it traditionally did. And maybe accepting that and changing the way that you approach regulation to be inclusive, but also, in a way that you're able to set your own terms and boundaries might be better advice in the long run, rather than a knee-jerk reaction whenever something bad happens, or if there's a hack, or if somebody does something illegal, to respond in a kind of reactive fashion.
Mm-hmm. I have a question for you, Khurram. So when we start thinking about cryptocurrency and the blockchain, how does this all tie together with the metaverse? How does all of this play a role together? I mean, we keep hearing about, Meta, the company formerly known as Facebook, and now you've got the Bored Ape Yacht Club launching their own coin, right? Which apparently is a utility token or a governance token. How do you envision, down the road, we're thinking maybe 5-10 years, how all of this is going to come together?
That's a great question. I got to be careful, because I feel like the terms get thrown around and don't have fixed meanings, or
sure.
But I think people kind of understand the general concepts. And I guess the way I see them tying together is, I was just on Nabila's question, I brought up the smartphone piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I really do think that smartphones have like a kind of underrated importance in crypto, because it's kind of a non-obvious one. And it relates to your question on the metaverse, in the sense that one of the effects of everybody having a phone on you versus, the laptops, I think, and computers, PCs, they're still widely used, but I think the numbers, I don't have them offhand, but I think there's something like, maybe like 2 billion active computers at any given moment, maybe, I don't know, maybe more, but almost everybody has a phone, a smartphone now. Nearly everybody has a phone, a cell phone. And so the difference between like everybody having a phone on you, and remember, like, our phones, we almost never turn them off. They're just like almost always on, both on us and on at the same time. And so the relationship that we have to information is no longer really one where we go out looking for it. We're connected, and then things come to us and we set the filters and whatnot. And so anybody who has a phone kind of has like a virtual, at least one virtual persona or self, or like a digital identity in the metaverse, because everybody with a phone probably has at least one social media account. And even if they don't have social media, they probably have at least one messaging app. And if they have one messaging app, or one way of communicating with people who are not in their time and space, then you basically instantly created this virtual version of yourself that is accessible through time and space, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a really that's a very fundamental change in the way that we would interact with people. We have an entire world set up with institutions and patterns and ways of interacting with people to manage how we get information and how we interact with people that is based on the fact that you used to have to really physically be in the same presence with somebody to have a relationship with them. And that's not really the case anymore. You can have one, in most cases, many digital identities and these kind of digital avatars that are out there. And then when you talk about, it's funny because you mentioned the Bored Ape Yacht Club. That's one of my favorite examples in crypto because it's one, NFTs generally, they're seen with a lot of skepticism because people say like, why would you pay so much money for this profile picture? But if you think about what we were just talking about, like what's the effect of having a phone? You create this digital version of yourself, which is oftentimes represented by a photo or a profile picture that you have on these various platforms, right? When you think about that being one of the primary ways that we now interact and exist, it shouldn't be all that surprising that in the same way that, lots of people have cars and some people that get really into cars decide they want to spend a lot of money on a really, really nice car, that a lot of people would say, hey, you're a complete moron. Why would you spend that much money on a car? My car gets me from point A to B, right? And right. It becomes a kind of fashion, icon. It becomes a kind of way of signaling status. And so profile pictures, when you think about what is the effect of the smartphone and the way that it creates not just, the metaverse, but all these little metaverses, right? And like, you can go back and, look at the way people wrote about the telegraph and radio and the phone and the way that those in the newspaper and the way that all of those different technologies created a public and an audience, this idea that like, okay, now there's just these group of people out there who are paying attention to this subject matter that exists, right? And they're in different locations, but there's this kind of meta digital universe, this kind of shared public that we all have, right? And for a long time, there were institutions that can control what that public was and how you could get to be part of that public and who got to write and publish into that broader public, right? Mm-hmm. And then we had, the internet comes along and now anybody can kind of write to the public and can be out there and can create an audience. And now you start talking about these digital universes and the metaverse and you say, okay, I can create my own little universe on the internet because I have this floating representation of myself and I can connect asynchronously with all kinds of different people. But now we all have phones and we can all do it. And it's like a little bit chaotic and it's kind of crazy. And everybody understands intuitively the concept of like an internet mob and misinformation and things kind of running around rampantly. So I don't think it's surprising when you look at what happened in the, from 2010 to 2020, that 2020 to 2030 looks the way it does because people say to themselves, okay, what are the ways that I might be able to organize myself and groups of people in this chaotic environment? And crypto and NFTs represent ways of doing that in different capacities because, they cordon off basically a way, but they're interoperable at the same time. So they provide an opportunity for anyone to be part of it, but it requires needing to purchase the cryptocurrency to use the network or have the token to be able to access the community. And I think, in that lens, the use of crypto and NFTs kind of work in the metaverse as a kind of organizing function. Maybe it works like, internet money, maybe like it's the way we transact, or maybe it's something slightly different. But it's the kind of way that we collateralize or have some skin in the game so that instead of being an internet mob of people that are, trading on Reddit, trying to trade stocks based off Reddit threads, or, if that actually was what happened or not, who knows? But, instead of just being kind of this loose ragtag group of people, you could have a more coordinated structure to the way of interacting with people where everyone had skin in the game, or there's a way to transact, and that existence of that community is resistant to censorship, is resistant to control by any of the gatekeepers that are able, that would have been able to traditionally control, who got to say what or who gets to organize how.
Right. Well, I know that the Bored Ape Yacht Club launched ApeCoin last week. I think the market cap right now stands at about 3 billion, which makes, the ApeCoin the top 50 in out of all the coins that are available. what do you see just in terms of how that community uses that coin? I know that the concept right now is that it's a governance token. People that control most of the tokens are able to vote on certain proposals, but it's also trading on decentralized exchanges. I mean, I can go on to Binance or Coinbase right now and pick up some ApeCoin if I believe in it. How does that, where does the convergence of, hey, this is more of a gamble, or I'm investing in, the ape community versus, hey, this is actually something that's used, I want to acquire as much as I can so that I can start helping make decisions in that community. I mean, where does that kind of like blend, and where does that go?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the answer is that it blends. I think that's the right thing. That's what I think about it. A lot of people certainly, if I'm being honest, and I think if anyone's being honest in the space, a lot of the interest is driven by the fact that people think there's money to be made, and they're purchasing, even though they shouldn't be. They're purchasing for investment or speculative purposes. That will happen, I think, whenever there's an opportunity for people to make money. There'll be all kinds of speculation, and people will try to purchase for that reason. That being said, I do think a very critical component of the value proposition here is the opportunity for upside, and the opportunity for being able to be rewarded for being an early adopter or an early member of a community. And, whether that justifies whatever valuations, and, people certainly talk about and describe and provide analytics on all of these assets as though they are stocks or any kind of traditional financial instrument. So I understand why people look at them that way. But I think whether you can justify a certain valuation, hard to say. Hard for me to be able to say what something should be price wise.
Sure.
What I can't
is
say
it
though,
a financially
is
regulated? Sorry, is it a financially regulated coin then? I mean, as the view of the government going, hey, ApeCoin is a tradable financial instrument. It should be regulated. There should be policy around this so that people don't get totally wrecked, right, if the price decides to drop. I mean, is that really kind of, some of the thought process around why these policies are being put into place?
I would say in the United States, the way the regulatory environment works is everybody is regulated in the sense that it's a matter of what activities you're doing, and whether the activities you do veer into all of the various agencies and the rules that they make, or legislation that exists on certain regulated industries. From what I've seen on it, it certainly looks like it fits the mold of the various other assets that take the position that they're not a security or some kind of regulated financial instrument in the sense of a stock or a traditional financial instrument in that sense. But I do think there's certainly financial value associated with it, of course, and that's a big component of it. And I think there's a good reason for it, which is it also serves to kind of protect the initial community and early adopters, because a lot of the arguments you'll hear that people will make to criticize the use of one token or another is, why couldn't you just do this with traditional currency? You can pay online in all kinds of other ways, right? Why couldn't I just create a club with a subscription where everybody has to pay a certain amount to get in? Why do I need an NFT where somebody has to pay me in crypto to join this community? Or why do I need a governance token that's made just for this community? And I think it has to do with understanding, the kind of little economies that you're able to create. And what we were talking about, Sam, you asked the question on how this ties to the metaverse, right? And the idea you have these different communities that exist online. How do they interact? How do you create an environment where two people or a few people or a group of people who don't really know each other and are not going to be able to be in physical proximity to each other to assess or to create any kind of trust with each other? How are these people going to interact and coordinate in a way that they can trust each other? And if you're not friends with somebody and they're not your family, usually the next best way we trust people is if it's a commercial arrangement and you're paying for something and there's an exchange of value where people feel like somebody has some skin in the game. And that's really the way that I look at a lot of this, which is, hey, this is a way to have some skin in the game. And the reason why you want a native token for governance, or why you need a certain cryptocurrency, and rather than just using fiat, is it provides protection to those initial users in the sense that if you are in a community that is using USD as your baseline entry point, right, then that means that until your community hits a certain size, there's always the risk that somebody who has a lot of USD can kind of commandeer your community, because they can come in, right, in the same way that a lot of social media platforms, once they got big, right, it was kind of like social media started and people said, oh wow, this is like kind of silly and a joke, and then like next thing you know, people were saying the complete opposite, like this is the end of the world, like nothing is it's probably, the answer is probably somewhere in between that, not on either spectrum. But a lot of that had to do with the fact that once the platforms became popular, if you were a bad actor, or even if you weren't a bad actor, you were just trying to be a manipulative actor and wanted to game their algorithm, you could pour a lot of money into their advertising model or through other means with influencers or whatever it was to try to push and control the way content appeared on that platform, right? And now if you're an early Facebook user, an early Twitter user who brought a lot of people on and were one of the early users when not a lot of people used it, now your contribution and your value and your role is being and your use of the service is being hampered by some outside party who had no skin in the game in the first place, right? Whereas if every time I wanted to buy an ad on Twitter, I needed to convert my money into a currency that had a fixed supply on Twitter, then it would create this kind of little economy where, in theory, if there was more demand, right, there would be this kind of metered approach to how you could enter the ecosystem or how you could use the software. It's kind of like metering of software or metering of a platform, metering of a community. And that provides I think the most important thing is that it provides protection and the right aligns incentives. Whether, you take it the other direction, and that means that those things should be the subject of intense speculation and people guessing that a certain community will be valuable, hard to say whether it's justified or not. But again, there's an exclusivity to it. Being a member of the Bored Ape Yacht Club gives you access. You are one of the people that gets a lot of the other airdrops that are out there because it's a exclusive community that people want to start with. So it becomes a way to curate things on the internet rather than putting something on the internet that's accessible to all. Putting something on the internet that's accessible only to people that you want to see it. Token gated links, I think, are one of the most interesting innovations of late, where you used to just be able to publish and it was either for everybody or you just didn't publish at all. And I think publishing to everybody has had all these types of different effects, right? Things get taken out of context. People get canceled because something they said in one setting is taken to a different setting. Or justified or not, just kind of the reality of how that works. And then you could envision an environment where publishing to the internet doesn't mean in the future won't mean what it means today, where it necessarily means that for everybody in the world they could go to this website and see it. Maybe it means just publishing something that only a closed group of people that can see that you want to see sees it, and if somebody wants to see it beyond that, there's some commercial aspect that provides you some protection and comfort, that your information won't be used in some way you don't want, or that the content you put out there isn't taken out of context.
And all are tradable. I mean, I could go onto a centralized or decentralized exchange like a Sushi Swap or a Dex Tools and trade these tokens.
That's right. The technology that underpins tokens is open source, and so it's quite easy for people to create applications to plug in for purposes of transacting and trading. Okay,
so thank you so much, Sam, Khurram, for this very informative session on cryptocurrency. I hope our audience and I have definitely learned a lot. The cryptocurrencies have been a hot topic in the global financial system for some time. There's great volatility of cryptocurrencies exchange rates. With this, there is a high risk of trading these cryptocurrencies. Their growth has been able to gain the attention of many speculators. They're easily portable, they're decentralized. It is only after the required trust in the cryptocurrencies, after which they will be used on a wider scale. And I hope that, the governments, the policymakers will adopt it, and we use this technology far and wide. There's exciting times, and we are all excited. I'm excited. Thank you so much.